Ilara traced the intricate frost patterns on the laundry room window of St. Jude's Home for Children. Outside, the Appalachian hills cradling the town of Harmony Creek were a somber tapestry of rust and gold, their vibrancy stolen by a heavy, gray sky. A deep chill had settled in the valley, the kind that promised an early, bitter winter and made the old orphanage feel even draftier. At 16, Ilara was one of the oldest residents, a status that made her a silent authority among the younger children and a ghost to the staff, who had long since given up on her being adopted. Her final chore was to fetch firewood from the shed before dusk swallowed the last of the light. Pulling her thin cardigan tighter, she stepped into the biting air, which smelled of damp earth and distant wood smoke. As she methodically stacked split logs into a canvas carrier, a sound cut through the evening quiet, a low, guttural groan. It came from the narrow, refuse-strewn alley that ran between the orphanage's crumbling fence and the old, disused cannery. A jolt of fear, cold and sharp, went through her. Her first instinct, honed by years of keeping her head down, was to ignore it, to retreat into the relative safety of St. Jude's. But the sound came again, weaker this time, a pained exhalation that was terrifyingly human. Hesitantly, she set down the wood and crept toward the alley's entrance, her worn boots making no sound on the packed dirt. The shadows were deep and menacing, clinging to the cold brick walls like a shroud. He was slumped against the grimy wall, half hidden by an overflowing dumpster. He wore a dark wool suit, now torn at the shoulder and stained with something much darker than the surrounding grime. Blood, a lot of it. His face was ashen, his breathing ragged and shallow. He wasn't from Harmony Creek. No one here owned a suit that fine, even in perfect condition. His expensive leather shoes were scuffed beyond repair, one lying on its side a few feet away, a lonely, pathetic sight. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. She should run, scream, get Mrs. Gable. But she was frozen, captivated by the raw agony in the man's eyes as they fluttered open and struggled to focus on her. He tried to speak, but only a bloody froth appeared at his lips, a stark crimson against his pale skin. Compassion, a force more potent than her fear, finally propelled her forward. She knelt beside him on the cold, cracked pavement that smelled of decay. Without a second thought, she took the clean hem of her worn woolen dress and gently, so gently, wiped the blood from his chin. For a fleeting moment, his eyes cleared, a flicker of lucid gratitude shining through the pain. His cold hand shot out, grabbing hers with a surprising, desperate strength. He pressed something small, metallic, and intricately shaped into her palm, his fingers closing hers around it. "Find the mockingbird's song," he rasped, his voice a ghost of a whisper. A final, shuddering breath escaped his chest, and the light in his eyes was extinguished. The weight of his hand fell away, leaving Ilara kneeling in the encroaching darkness, the strange, cold object clutched in her fist. From the orphanage, Mrs. Gable's sharp voice sliced through the silence. "Ilara, what's keeping you? Get that wood in here now." "Ilara, now, Mrs." Gable's voice, sharp and unforgiving, sliced through the alley's thick silence. It was the sound of her reality crashing back in. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Ilara, eclipsing the shock. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the sudden quiet. Her eyes darted from the man's still face to the dark mouth of the alley. She couldn't be found here. Not with him, not with this. Scrambling to her feet, her worn sneakers slipping on the damp cobblestones, she clutched the metal object in her palm. It was cold, its intricate edges digging into her skin, a solid, terrifying anchor to the last few minutes. She took one last, wide-eyed look at the man, a stranger who had died in her hands, and then she ran. She fled back towards the relative safety of St. Jude's, her breath coming in ragged sobs, the matron's call echoing in her mind. Inside, the familiar scent of bleach and old wood did nothing to soothe her. She bypassed the common room, her movements furtive and silent, a ghost in her own home. In the sparsely furnished dormitory she shared with 3 other girls, she knelt beside her simple cot. Her gaze fell upon a loose floorboard near the wall, its edges warped by years of damp Appalachian winters. With trembling fingers, she pried it open, revealing a small, dark void. It was where she kept her only treasures: a faded photo of the parents she never knew and a small, polished river stone. Without a second thought, she pushed them aside and placed the cold, metal object inside. As she slid the board back into place, the secret felt sealed, buried within the very foundations of the orphanage and within her. Sleep was a distant country she couldn't reach. Every creak of the old building was the man's final gasp, every shadow in the corner his lifeless form. The phrase, "Mockingbird's song," played on a loop in her head, a riddle with no answer. The next morning, the nightmare became real. It didn't arrive as a whisper, but as a scream, the high, piercing wail of a siren tearing through the morning mist. From the dormitory window, Alara watched as a police car, its lights flashing silently, pulled to a stop at the entrance of the alley. Soon, another arrived, followed by a somber black vehicle. Sheriff Brody Thompson stepped out. He was a tall man, his face weathered and serious, a familiar sight in Harmony Creek. He surveyed the scene, his expression grim, while his deputy cordoned off the area with yellow tape. The town was waking up to a murder, her murder. It felt like hers, a terrible secret she had birthed in the dusk. From her window, she watched them lift a black bag onto a gurney, and a profound, isolating fear settled over her. She was no longer just an orphan. She was a witness, shackled to a dead man's last words. The fluorescent lights of the sheriff's office hummed, a stark contrast to the misty Appalachian morning outside. Sheriff Brody Thompson rubbed his tired eyes, staring at the preliminary report on his desk. John Doe, that's all he had. The man in the alley was a ghost. No wallet, no phone, no identification. His suit was tailored, expensive silk, and his leather shoes were worn but clearly high quality. He didn't belong in Harmony Creek, and certainly not dead in a back alley. Brody took a swig of lukewarm coffee. His deputy, a young man named Caleb, shifted his weight by the door. "Anything, Sheriff?" "Nothing," Brody sighed, tossing the pen onto his desk. Manicured nails, $500 shoes, and not a single person in a 10-mile radius has a clue who he is. It's like he dropped out of the sky. The news spread through town faster than a summer storm. At St. Jude's, the whispers were relentless. Alara heard them over breakfast, during chores, and in the quiet moments in the dormitory. They said he was a federal agent, a mobster, a runaway millionaire. Each story was more elaborate than the last, and each one made the metal object hidden beneath her floorboard feel heavier, colder. Her paranoia grew with every passing hour. She saw suspicion in the eyes of Mrs. Gable, the matron, and felt the weight of her secret press down on her chest whenever she heard sirens in the distance. The man's last words echoed in her mind, a constant, looping puzzle. Find the mockingbird's song. It wasn't just a message, it was a burden, a responsibility she hadn't asked for. She knew she couldn't stay silent forever, but she couldn't go to the sheriff. What would she say? That she was out after curfew? That she'd found a dying man and instead of getting help, she'd run away? They would never believe her. That afternoon, using the pretense of an errand, Alara slipped away to the Harmony Creek Public Library. The small stone building smelled of aging paper and floor polish, a sanctuary of silence. She approached the front desk, her heart pounding. "Excuse me," she whispered to the librarian, a stern-looking woman named Miss Albright. "Do you have any books on local folk songs?" Miss Albright peered at her over her spectacles. "Folklore section, back corner to the left, don't make a mess." Alara scurried to the dimly lit corner. The shelves were filled with thin, forgotten volumes on Appalachian history and culture. She ran her finger along the spines, her breath catching when she saw it. A slim, unassuming book titled Echoes of the Valley, Ballads of Harmony Creek. Her hands trembled as she opened the table of contents. And there it was, Chapter 4, The Mockingbird's Song. It wasn't a song. It was a poem, a lament about a local tragedy from a generation ago, involving a dispute between two founding families. As she read the cryptic verses about a hidden treasure and a bitter betrayal, a name stood out, mentioned in the poem's dedication: McKinley. the name of the reclusive family who lived in the sprawling, dark mansion on the ridge overlooking the town. A family as old and full of secrets as the mountains themselves. The name McKinley echoed in Alara's mind. A heavy stone dropped into the silent pool of her fear. Back in the sterile quiet of her small room, the copied words of the poem lay on her thin blanket, the ink a stark black against the white page. Each line felt like a warning. Downstairs, the life of the orphanage hummed along, oblivious, but for Alara, the world had narrowed to the cold weight of the metal object beneath the floorboards and the shadow of the mansion on the hill. She knew she couldn't stay hidden. Fear was a paralyzing force, but guilt was a goad pushing her forward. She had to understand. She found Mrs. Gable in the kitchen, her hands dusted with flour. "I'm going for a walk," Alara said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Just need some air." The matron, preoccupied, simply nodded, a gesture of absent-minded permission that felt like a blessing. The autumn air bit at Alara's cheeks as she left the familiar streets of Harmony Creek behind. The road leading toward the McKinley estate began to climb, winding away from the town's modest homes and into the dense Appalachian woods. The air grew stiller, the silence broken only by the crunch of fallen leaves under her worn sneakers. Then, through a break in the trees, she saw it. The McKinley mansion wasn't just a house, it was a declaration. Built of dark, weathered stone, it loomed over the valley, its many windows like vacant eyes. It was surrounded by a formidable stone wall, at least 10 feet high, that seemed to go on forever. Feeling impossibly small, Alara followed the perimeter of the wall. Its surface was cold and rough against her fingertips. There were no cameras visible, no signs of guards, just an unnerving, perfect stillness. Peering over a lower section, she glimpsed the grounds within, a world apart. Manicured lawns, sculpted hedges, and trees with vibrant, unfamiliar foliage stood in stark contrast to the wild forest outside. It was a fortress, designed to keep the world out. Meanwhile, in his quiet office, Sheriff Brody Thompson stared at a nearly empty evidence board. The case was a ghost, the victim a phantom. His deputy, Cadden, had confirmed what he already knew. No one had reported a missing person matching the man's description anywhere in the state. The trail was ice cold. Frustrated, Brody picked up the evidence bag containing the victim's boots. He'd looked them over a dozen times. But this time, his eyes caught something wedged deep in the tread of the sole. Using a pair of tweezers, he carefully extracted a small, delicate leaf. It was a perfect, fan-shaped sliver of gold. A ginkgo leaf. Brody's breath caught in his throat. He wasn't a botanist, but he was a man who knew his county. And he knew there was only one place for miles that had ginkgo trees, planted decades ago by the family's patriarch. The immaculate, private gardens of the McKinley estate. Hidden in the dense cover of overgrown rhododendrons across the road, Alara held her breath. The familiar black and white patrol car of the Harmony Creek Sheriff's Department crunched slowly up the long, gravel driveway of the McKinley estate. Her own clandestine mission had just collided with the official arm of the law. Sheriff Brody Thompson stepped out of his vehicle, his posture radiating a determination that seemed to shrink in the shadow of the colossal mansion. He walked to the heavy oak door and lifted the stern, iron lion's head knocker, letting it fall with a thud that was swallowed by the sheer scale of the place. Moments later, the door opened, not with the creak of an old home, but the quiet swing of precision engineering. A tall, severe-looking man in a perfectly tailored dark suit stood in the doorway, his expression as neutral and impenetrable as the polished wood beside him. "Sheriff Brody Thompson," Thompson said, his voice firm. "I need to speak with Mr. or Mrs. McKinley." "The McKinleys are not receiving visitors today," the man replied, his tone impeccably polite yet dismissive. "I am Arthur, the estate manager. Perhaps I can assist you." "This is an official murder investigation, Arthur," Thompson said, pulling out the small plastic bag containing the ginkgo leaf. He held it up. "We have reason to believe the victim was on this property shortly before he died. This leaf was lodged in the tread of his boot. These trees are quite specific to your estate, wouldn't you agree? Arthur's gaze barely flickered to the evidence. We have extensive gardens, Sheriff. Botanists, staff, and contractors have access. A stray leaf is hardly conclusive. I assure you, our security is thorough. No unauthorized individuals have been on these grounds. He offered a thin, unconvincing smile. I will, of course, inform the family of your inquiry. I'd rather inform them myself, Thompson pressed, his patience wearing thin. That will not be possible, Arthur stated, the politeness hardening into a final verdict. Without a warrant, I'm afraid this conversation is over. Good day, Sheriff. The heavy door clicked shut, leaving Sheriff Thompson standing alone on the stone steps, a man of authority rendered powerless by private wealth. From her hiding place, Alara watched the entire exchange. She saw the sheriff, a man the whole town respected and slightly feared, turned away as if he were a nuisance. A cold dread washed over her, followed by a surge of defiant clarity. The law couldn't get through the front door, so she would have to find a back one. Her mind raced, sifting through the faces and stories of Harmony Creek. Who would know the secrets of that house? Her thoughts snagged on a memory. Martha, an elderly woman who sold homemade jams and pickles at the Saturday market. Martha had worked as a housekeeper for the McKinleys for 20 years before being abruptly let go. She often spoke of it in hushed, bitter tones. Martha was the back door. As Sheriff Thompson got into his car, his jaw tight with frustration, Alara slipped away from the tree line. He was going back to his office to fight a wall of lawyers and influence. She was going back to town to find a ghost from the McKinleys' past. The Saturday market in Harmony Creek was a vibrant tapestry of mountain life. The air, crisp with the scent of pine and damp earth, was layered with the smells of kettle corn, fresh-baked bread, and ripe apples. Alara, her heart a nervous drum against her ribs, moved through the throng of shoppers, her eyes scanning the faces of the older women. Her only clue was a name, Martha, and the vague description of kind eyes and a weary smile she'd pieced together from town whispers. She found her standing before a stall piled high with potatoes and onions, her shoulders slightly stooped, just as described. Alara took a deep breath and approached. "Excuse me, are you Martha?" The woman turned, her eyes guarded. "Who's asking?" Alara's voice was barely a whisper. "My name is Alara. I was hoping to ask you about some local history. About the McKinley family." Martha's face hardened instantly. She shook her head, turning back to the vegetables. "I have nothing to say about them. It's best you forget that name." "Please," Alara pressed, stepping closer. "It's about the Mockingbird's song." At the mention of the poem, Martha froze. She slowly turned back, her eyes searching Alara's face, seeing not a threat, but a desperate girl. "Why would a child like you be digging up that old bone?" "Because someone died for it," Alara said, her voice trembling. She carefully pulled the cold metal object from her pocket, shielding it with her hand. "A man gave me this. He was dying. He told me to remember the song." Martha's breath hitched, her gaze fixed on the object, a flicker of pained recognition in her eyes. "Daniel," she whispered, the name hanging in the air like a ghost. She pulled Alara away from the main thoroughfare into the narrow space between two stalls. "You shouldn't have this. You shouldn't be involved." "Who was Daniel?" Alara asked. "He was a good man," Martha said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "He worked at the estate like my husband did. He learned something terrible about Mr. McKinley's father. An old sin buried deep. He wrote that poem to try and tell the world without getting himself killed. But they silenced him. They ran him out of town, ruined his name, and made sure no one would ever listen to the Mockingbird again." Back in his quiet office, the only sounds were the hum of the computer and the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. Sheriff Thompson typed McKinley Estate, former employees into his database. A long list of names scrolled down the screen. He began the painstaking process of cross-referencing them with state records. Most were dead ends. Then, a name flagged a red alert: Daniel Carter. Hired as a groundskeeper, fired for theft 2 months later, 20 years ago. The most chilling detail was a missing persons report filed a week after his termination, a case that had gone cold for 2 decades. The name resonated with a deep, unsettling certainty. "What did he want me to do?" Ilara asked, her hand tightening around the metal object. "He wanted the truth to be heard," Martha replied, her gaze firm but fearful. "But listen to me, child. That family owns this town. They buried Daniel's truth once before. You be careful they don't bury you with it." Leaving Martha's cottage, the cool evening air did little to quell the fire in Ilara's chest. Daniel Carter. He had a name, a story. His locket felt heavy in her palm, not with weight, but with purpose. She knew then that she couldn't give it to the sheriff. Not yet. One girl's story, a dead man's trinket, it was kindling, not a bonfire. The McKinleys would smother it just as they had smothered Daniel's life 20 years ago. For 2 days, Ilara moved like a ghost through Harmony Creek, but this time, she wasn't hiding. She was searching. She started with the names Martha had whispered, families who had lost their businesses, farmers whose land had been mysteriously rezoned. She sought out the wives and mothers, the women who managed the household accounts and remembered the quiet threats. In dim kitchens and on secluded porches, she presented the locket. She recited the lines from the Mockingbird's song. She told them about Daniel. "They count on us being alone," she told a baker's wife whose husband had been financially ruined. "They can't silence all of us." To an elderly woman who lost her family farm to a sudden, legal seizure, she said, "Your silence is their power. Our presence is ours." Fear was a hard wall to chip away, but Ilara's unwavering resolve was the chisel. A nod here, a tearful agreement there. The whispers grew, weaving a network of shared grief and quiet fury that spread from house to house. Dawn broke on the 3rd day, painting the sky in pale shades of gray and rose. A cold mist clung to the streets. Ilara stood on the steps of the old town hall, dressed in a simple black dress. For a moment, she was alone. Then, from the fog, one figure emerged, then 2 more, and then dozens. Women of all ages, all in black, their faces etched with a solemn determination. They came from every corner of the town, a silent, swelling tide of nearly 200. They didn't carry signs or shout slogans. Their power was in their unity, their footsteps a soft, rhythmic drumbeat on the pavement as they marched toward the sheriff's department. Sheriff Brody Thompson was pouring his first coffee when he saw them. He stopped, the mug halfway to his lips, and stared as the sea of black filled the street before his office. He walked outside, his expression a mixture of awe and apprehension. Ilara stepped forward, the crowd parting for her. She was no longer the frightened orphan from the alley. She was the voice of her community. She held out the tarnished silver locket. "This belonged to Daniel Carter," she said, her voice ringing with clarity in the quiet morning. "He was murdered to protect the McKinley's secrets. His poem told the truth." She paused, her gaze sweeping over the women behind her. "We are his song now. We will not be silenced." One by one, other women stepped up, their voices joining hers, layering stories of intimidation and loss. Brody looked from Ilara's fierce eyes to the faces of the women, the town's backbone. He had a name, a motive, and now a public mandate he could not ignore. The political shield the McKinleys had hidden behind for decades had just been shattered. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "I'll get the warrant," he said, his voice firm. A ripple of victory passed through the crowd. As the women began to disperse, Ilara remained, watching the sun climb higher, its light finally cutting through the fog. She had given a voice to a dead man, and in doing so, had helped a whole town find its own.